Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to the forested ridgelines of southern Styria in the autumn of 1914, where a chain of watchtowers stands sentinel along the passes leading north toward Vienna. In Tower 27, two men have spent the last 3 weeks tending their signal lamps and logging the silence of the forest below, a silence that very recently has begun to mean something else entirely. My name is Matthias Eder, trooper of the southern Austrian watch line, and I want to start with the lamp. Not the beacon, that came later and I will get to it, but the small shutter lamp on the south-facing shelf, the one we used for routine signals. It was a squat, ugly thing, a pressed tin body the size of a coffee pot, with a hinged shutter on the front face, spring-loaded so it would snap back shut if you took your thumb off the lever. The lens was ground glass, scratched in one corner from some previous occupant who had presumably put the thing down on gravel without thinking. It burned lamp-grade paraffin, which had a smell I would come to associate completely with Tower 27, something between a pharmacy and a stable, warm and slightly sour, soaking into the wood of the shelf and the wool of our coats over weeks. Otto Falk had shown me how to operate it on the first evening. He had the patience of a man who had spent years explaining things to people who would rather learn by instinct than instruction. He did not talk down to me. He simply demonstrated each step once, then asked me to repeat it, then watched me do it on my own, correcting nothing unless I was about to do something that would cost us oil or damage the mechanism. "The shutter," he said, "is not a switch. It is a word. You are choosing which words to say and in what order. If you hurry, you slur. If you are careless, you say something you did not mean." He held the lamp and snapped the shutter. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. The signal carried through the autumn dark toward where Tower 28 sat on its ridge 3 kilometers to the east. "You understand?" I said. I understood. "Good. Now do it yourself." I was 21 years old. Otto was 43. He had served on the southern front line before a piece of shrapnel took the last 2 fingers of his left hand, leaving him eligible for reassignment somewhere the army considered quieter. The watchtower line was what they gave him. He did not complain about it. He said the work was honest and the view was magnificent when the fog lifted, and he had never been a man who needed noise to feel useful. Tower 27 stood on a forested ridge in southern Styria, roughly 40 kilometers north of the Karawankan passes and perhaps 60 from the coast, though you could not smell the sea from where we were. The forest was mixed, beech and spruce mostly, with stands of larch turning yellow in the October cold, and the ridge gave a clear sight line south and southwest along 3 valley corridors that ran, broadly speaking, toward Rijeka. That was the point. Rijeka had fallen. The heretic legions had taken it 2 years earlier, fortified it, and launched their coastal operations from it, mostly naval, mostly west, but the threat of an overland thrust northward through the Austrian passes had never been fully dismissed by anyone who studied the maps carefully. The watchtower line existed because of that threat. 29 towers in total. We were told this, though I never counted them or verified it, spaced roughly 3 kilometers apart along the ridge system from the Slovenian border to somewhere in the hills above the Mur Valley. Each tower was connected to the next by shutter lamp in clear conditions, by signal mirror in strong sunlight, by bells in fog or low cloud, and by the beacon cage at the tower's crown when the situation was serious enough to require something visible from a distance of 20 kilometers or more. The principle was simple. If the heretics moved north in force, the towers would light up in sequence, each one relaying to the next, until the warning reached the garrison towns and the railway depots and the staff offices in Graz, where someone with enough rank and enough telephone lines could respond. In practice, the line's main function was to relay nothing. Most evenings, Tower 28 answered our signal with the standard acknowledgement, 4 short pulses, a pause, 2 long, and Tower 26 confirmed to our west in kind. Most mornings, there was nothing in the logbook but weather notation and the scheduled exchanges. The line was watching for something that, for as long as either of us had been posted there, had not arrived. Otto said this was exactly how a working watchtower line should feel. "The moment it stops feeling like nothing," he told me in the second week, sitting on his bunk with his boots off and his socked feet propped against the iron leg of the stove, "is the moment you must trust the routine more, not less. A bored man starts to improvise. An improvised signal is how you cause a false alarm that empties 3 towns of fighting men and embarrasses the regiment." He turned a page in the small, dense printed book he kept on the shelf above his bunk, a collection of alpine botanical illustrations of all things, and did not look up. "The routine is not a substitute for judgment. The routine is what your judgment rests on. Without it, you are guessing." I wrote that down in my personal notebook. I still have the notebook. I have looked at that passage a great many times since. The tower itself was a squat stone structure, round-walled, with walls perhaps 60 centimeters thick at the base, narrowing slightly toward the crown. It rose about 12 meters from the ground to the parapet, with an interior wooden staircase of 41 steps. I counted them often enough that the number is worn into my memory. That switch backed up through 3 floors and then emerged onto the open platform at the top where the beacon cage hung on its iron winch arm. The ground floor served as a storeroom and, in theory, a defensive hold. There were rifle slits cut into the walls at 2 heights, and the door was iron-banded oak. The middle floor was our living space. 2 bunks, a table, a cast-iron stove, 2 shelves, a wall hook for coats and kit, and a small south-facing window with a hinged shutter of its own. The top floor, just below the platform, was the signal room. 2 lamp brackets, a mirror rack, the logbook shelf, the bell mechanism, a suspended iron bell with a pull cord that ran down to the middle floor for use when we needed to ring a signal and both hands were occupied, and the winch handle for the beacon. The beacon cage itself was an iron frame, roughly the size of a small wardrobe, suspended on the winch arm so it could be lowered for loading and raised to the top of the arm for lighting. When loaded with the compressed, oil-soaked fiber bricks we kept in a sealed tin chest on the platform and ignited, it would produce a column of black smoke by day and a fierce orange light by night, visible, in clear conditions, for a considerable distance across the valleys below. There was also a secondary oil reservoir mounted on the cage frame, connected to a brass nozzle that could be opened to let paraffin drip onto the burning bricks and sustain the flame for longer than the bricks alone would manage. The reservoir had a capacity of about 6 liters. We kept it full. Every 4th day, Otto checked the reservoir level himself and noted it in the logbook, and every 7th day we ran a brief test of the winch, raising the cage halfway, holding it, lowering it again, testing the pawl and ratchet, to make sure nothing had seized in the damp. The damp was constant. October in Styrian hill country means rain 3 days in 5, and the other 2 are often fog. The stone walls sweated. The wooden stairs warped slightly and creaked on cold nights in a way that sounded, if you were not yet used to it, like footsteps. The logbook had to be stored in a waxed canvas envelope to keep the pages from going soft. Our boots never fully dried. We kept the stove burning for much of the night and banked it in the morning so it would be warm when we woke, and the firewood came from a stack in the storeroom that we replenished by carrying split logs up from a cord left at the base of the tower path, about 100 meters down the ridge. The path was not steep, but it was muddy in wet weather, and carrying armloads of firewood up a slippery slope in the rain was the sort of task that builds a particular kind of quiet resentment if you let it. Otto did not let it. He treated the firewood run as he treated everything, methodically, without complaint, as one item in the sequence of items that kept the post functional. He would pull on his oilskin, pull on his cap, and go down for the wood as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and return damp and muddy, and deposit the logs beside the stove with the same expression he wore when writing the weather notation in the logbook. Matter of fact, present, attending to the thing in front of him. I tried to model myself on this. I was not entirely successful. The monthly supply wagon had come on the 7th of October and left the same day. The driver and his helper, a boy about my age who did not speak much and kept looking at the forest as if expecting something to emerge from it, had brought flour, salt pork in a wax paper parcel, dried beans, 4 tins of sardines, lamp oil in 2-liter cans, 8 cans, which was the standard monthly allocation, cartridges for our rifles, 60 rounds each, the same allocation as every month, which struck me as optimistic given that we had fired none since arriving. 2 bundles of tallow candles, a small paper packet of coffee substitute, and a bundle of letters. Otto's letters were 3, 2 from a sister in Linz, 1 from a former sergeant of his acquaintance. Mine was 1, from my mother, written on cheap paper in her careful, small handwriting, asking after my health and telling me that my younger brother had passed his examinations and would be starting an apprenticeship in January. Also in the wagon, hidden in the flour sack by the driver with a conspiratorial wink and no verbal acknowledgement, was a small paper parcel of tobacco. Cheap, dark, slightly damp, the kind that burns hot and tastes of creosote, that Otto had evidently arranged through some channel I was not made aware of. He produced it at supper that night as if conjuring it from thin air, rolled 2 cigarettes with the efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and handed me one without comment. We smoked them on the platform in the cold, watching the valley fog collect in the low places, and I felt, for the first time since arriving, that I was beginning to understand what sort of posting this was. Not punishment, not oversight, not a forgotten corner of the war, a vigil, a slow, patient, necessary vigil, maintained by 2 men who understood their purpose and performed it without drama. 3 weeks until rotation home, Otto said, not unhappily, rolling the last of the tobacco into a cigarette for morning. The wagon would not return before then. We had what we had. It was enough. More than enough, he said, holding the cigarette up to examine its construction in the lamplight. A man who knows what he needs is never short. I have thought about that sentence a great many times since October. The first thing to understand about watchtower duty, if you have never done it, is that the hours are not divided the way they are in other postings. In a trench, your time is divided by the rhythm of artillery, by the shift changes, by the necessity of sleep snatched in whatever intervals the enemy permits. In a watchtower, there are no such interruptions. The day has a shape, and the shape is yours to maintain. We rose before dawn. Otto first, always. He would descend to the signal room while I was still pulling on my second sock, check the lamp oil, clean the shutter lens with a square of chamois kept on the logbook shelf specifically for that purpose, and note the overnight weather in the log. Then he would return to the stove, boil water, and make the coffee substitute, a thin, dark liquid that tasted of barley and disappointment. And we would eat breakfast standing or sitting on the bunks, depending on mood, looking at the south window as the light came up. Breakfast was bread when we had it, which after the supply wagon was for about 10 days, and then biscuit and salt pork when we did not. The biscuit was the army-issue type, hard enough to chip a tooth if you were not careful, and softened best by dunking in hot liquid, which is what we did. Otto ate with the mechanical focus of a man who viewed meals as maintenance rather than pleasure, but did not hold this view aggressively or inflict it on others. After breakfast, the first signal exchange. We would signal Tower 28 at first light, the standard morning code, a declaration of status, and a request for confirmation. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long. Tower 28 would respond, usually within a minute, sometimes 2, occasionally 5 if Brenner was the one handling the lamp and he was still arguing with his coffee, and their confirmation would be noted in the log with the time. Then we would signal Tower 26, different code, same procedure. Tower 26 was run by 2 men I never met in person. I knew only that their acknowledgments were prompt and their lamp work was clean, which Otto said was the only thing that mattered about your neighbors in this work. The rest of the morning was maintenance, oil levels in all 3 reservoirs, the signal lamp, the secondary lamp kept as a backup, and the beacon cage, winch mechanism, the powel, the ratchet, the rope condition, mirror rack, cleaned and angled to its reference mark in case the lamp failed and we needed to switch to heliograph, bell cord, tested by a single pull, enough to produce a small chime rather than a full ring, logbook, weather, visibility estimate, any smoke or movement observed in the valleys below. The visibility was the daily question. On clear days, there were perhaps 6 of them in the month I was there before October ended. The view from the platform was extraordinary. The ridges running south in successive waves of blue-green forest, the pale ribbon of a river in the middle distance, and at the very edge of sight, on the clearest days, a smudge on the horizon that Otto said might be the coast, though I was never certain I was seeing it rather than imagining it. On cloudy days, which was most of them, the forest below was a muted gray-green, and the signal exchanges required the lamp because the mirrors could not work without sun. On fog days, which came roughly twice a week, neither lamp nor mirror was reliable past 500 meters, and we relied on the bells, signaling in slow, deliberate pulses that could carry through the murk if the wind was not too loud. The bell signal was simpler than the lamp code. 3 ring pause 3 meant acknowledgement, 2 ring pause 1 meant request for emergency protocol, 1 continuous ring meant beacon authority. We had never used the last one. Otto said in his entire posting to the tower line, about 14 months spread across 2 separate rotations, he had never used it. Not for lack of occasion, he said one morning, while we were waiting for the fog to lift enough to attempt a lamp signal. He was sitting at the table with the logbook open, writing something that looked more careful than the usual weather notation. There were 2 nights last winter when Tower 24 went dark. 2 nights. No bell response, no lamp, no smoke in the morning. He did not look up from the logbook. Command sent a rider after the second night, found the men down with fever, bad water from the cistern apparently. They were both recovered inside a week. And if they hadn't been, he considered this, then the rider would have found something else, and Command would have needed to know. He closed the logbook. The beacon is not for uncertainty. The beacon is for certainty. It is the difference between raising an alarm and making a report. You raise an alarm when you know. You make a report when you suspect. Until Tower 28 or Tower 26 fails to respond, and you cannot account for it with weather or maintenance, you do not touch the beacon winch. I asked him what he would consider sufficient grounds for certainty. He thought about it for longer than I expected. If both neighbors go dark at once and stay dark past the morning exchange, he said at last. Or if you see confirmed movement in the valley corridors, not shadow, not animal, not your own eyes playing fog tricks on you, but real movement, men or vehicles, numbers you cannot explain by any other means. He paused. Or if something happens here that you cannot explain. He tapped the logbook. In which case, I hope you have the lamp working well enough to tell someone. I thought then that he was being thorough rather than cautious. I was wrong about that. He was being careful in the way that a man is careful when he has thought a great deal about what careful means. The afternoons were quieter. A midday signal exchange, a briefer code, status only. And then, depending on weather, either a watch shift on the platform or work in the tower. The watch shift meant sitting on the platform bench with the binoculars, a good pair, Zeiss, one of the few pieces of equipment the post had received that was unambiguously first-rate, and scanning the valley corridors in 30-minute arcs, south to southwest to southeast and back, noting anything that moved or changed. Clouds moving through valleys look, at first, very much like smoke. Animals moving through clearings look, at first, very much like men. The difference, Otto said, is that clouds do not stay in one place and animals do not maintain formation. In 3 weeks of afternoon watches, I saw 3 deer, 1 probable wild boar visible for about 4 seconds before the trees closed over it. A fire in what looked like a woodcutter's camp approximately 8 kilometers southwest. Noted in the log, the smoke pattern indicating domestic rather than military scale, and a great deal of rain. The evenings had their own rhythm, supper, modest, utilitarian, filling enough, then the evening signal exchange at last light, then lamp maintenance, then whatever time remained before sleep. Otto read his botanical book or wrote letters. I wrote in my notebook, mended kit, or played solitaire with a pack of cards I had brought from home, the edges of which were getting soft from handling. We talked sometimes, not extensively, not in the way men talk when they are bored and lonely and filling silence to avoid thinking, but in the more comfortable way of two people who have agreed on their boundaries and visit each other's company by choice rather than necessity. Otto had opinions about alpine flora, about the management of cisterns, about the proper way to maintain a rifle in damp conditions, about the poetry of Adalbert Stifter, and about the strategic failures of the past 30 years of the southern campaigns. I had opinions about fewer things, but held them more intensely, and he respected this in the way that experienced men sometimes respect the fierceness of the young, when they know it is not ignorant fierceness, but merely untempered. Some nights he talked about the southern front. Not the line. Tower 27 was many kilometers from any active front, but the positions he had held before the shrapnel. Trenches on the karst, he said. The karst was the worst. Rock that could not be properly dug, so you built up instead of down, and the shelling smashed your sandbag walls instead of burying them, and the splinters and rock chips from a near miss could be worse than a direct hit because they came from everywhere at once. He had lost 3 men in one afternoon to rock spray from a shell that would have been a near miss on any normal soil. He showed me the hand sometimes without comment, in the way men do when they have made their peace with a wound and do not feel the need to dramatize it. 2 fingers gone from the last knuckle of the ring finger down, the small finger entirely, the stump smooth and pale and slightly sunken in the way of old scars. He could still operate the lamp shutter with that hand, gripping the lever with thumb and middle finger, but it was slower and less clean than his right. He used his right for signaling, the left he used for everything else. "Better this than the eye," he said once, apropos of nothing in particular. "A man can work with 9 fingers. He cannot work at all if he cannot see." I agreed that this was true. He glanced at me. "You're nervous at night still." It was not a question, so I treated it as one. "A little. The stairs." "Yes. They've sounded like that since September," he said. "Stone contracts in the cold. The wood moves. It is not footsteps, but the brain wants it to be footsteps because it has been trained by many centuries of human experience to treat unexplained sounds in the dark as potential threats." He looked back at his book. "The correct response is to investigate once, confirm nothing, and thereafter file the sound in the appropriate category and stop giving it significance it does not possess. Have you investigated?" "Several times." "And?" "Nothing." "Good," he said. "Then you have already done the rational thing. The remaining nervousness is just habit. It will pass." It did not entirely pass, but I got better at categorizing it. The last signal exchange of the night was at the 10th hour after sunset, which in October meant approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. This was the exchange I came to think of as the Goodnight Signal, 3 short pulses from us to Tower 28, a 4-pulse response from them, then a repeat to Tower 26 in the opposite direction. Brief, formal, almost tender in its smallness. 3 tiny points of light moving through 3 kilometers of forest dark, confirming only that the men in the next tower were alive and alert and at their post. I told Otto this one evening, that I found the Goodnight Signal oddly comforting. He was quiet for a moment. "It is comforting," he said. "That is its function. 2 men in a stone tower in the middle of a forest would be badly served by an arrangement that made them feel entirely alone. The signal says, 'We are here, we have checked, we are maintaining the line.' It is as much for morale as for information." He set down his book. "But that is also why a dark tower is worse than an enemy in the open. An enemy in the open you can see. You know what you are dealing with. A dark tower means the morale function of the signal is absent, and so is the information function, and you do not know which you should be more worried about." I asked if he had ever seen a tower go dark unexpectedly. He said he had. He told me about Tower 24 again. The fever, the bad cistern water, the rider who found the men recovering. He told me about a tower further east, years before his current posting, where a lamp had malfunctioned completely, and the men had to signal with candles held behind the mirror until a replacement lamp arrived on the next supply wagon 3 days later. He told me about fog so dense that the bell signals could not be heard, and the towers had effectively operated in isolation for 36 hours, each man managing his post independently and hoping the line held in the absence of confirmation. All of those, he said, were mechanical or meteorological. The system accounts for them. The protocol assumes equipment will fail and weather will intervene. What the protocol cannot account for— He paused and looked at the south window, though there was nothing visible through it but dark. —Is something that removes the men. I waited. That is why the protocol requires the rider, he said. After 2 failed exchanges, the nearest garrison sends a rider. 1 rider, not an army. Just a man on a horse with a notebook, to see what happened. He picked up his book again. If the tower is empty and the logbook is gone and the equipment is damaged, that is when the rider writes in his notebook and rides hard. He said this in a matter-of-fact tone, the same tone he used when explaining the winch mechanism or the oil reservoir. I understood then that he had thought about this possibility in the same practical, methodical way he thought about everything, not because he expected it, but because a man who maintained the line took the line seriously, and taking the line seriously meant understanding what it existed to prevent. The warning must reach Vienna, he said. That was the whole point of the towers. If the heretic legions moved north through the passes, not their fleet, not their artillery, but their ground forces, their infantry and armor and whatever else they brought with them from Rijeka, the garrison towns in Styria would need time to deploy. The railway depots would need time to move men. Staff offices would need time to prepare the response. That time was measured in hours. If the first warning came from a cavalry scout rather than the tower line, those hours would be gone. 29 towers, he said. Each one is 3 hours, or 3 minutes, depending on which way you count. I slept better in those first weeks than I had expected to. The stove kept the room warm enough that I only needed 1 blanket. The stairs creaked, but I had filed them in the correct category. Tower 28 answered every exchange. Tower 26 answered every exchange. The line held. The 14th of October was when it changed. The morning exchange with Tower 28 was normal. The midday exchange was normal. The evening exchange at last light produced 3 short pulses from us, and nothing in return. Otto waited. He counted to 60, which he did silently and precisely, his lips moving slightly. He repeated the signal. He waited again. Nothing. He repeated it a 3rd time, which was not standard protocol. The standard was 2 attempts before logging a failed exchange and escalating to bell signal. He did not comment on the deviation. "Weather?" I said. He glanced at the sky. There was cloud, but not low cloud. The visibility was perhaps 2 kilometers in the direction of Tower 28's ridge. "Possibly," he said. "Their lamp may be having trouble. Oil, wick, shutter mechanism." He turned away from the lamp and made the log entry. 1831. Tower 28. No response. 3 attempts. Visibility moderate. Weather overcast, no precipitation. Tower 26 confirmed normal at 1828. He wrote it without emphasis, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, because in principle it was. But he repeated the attempt at 9 o'clock, when the Goodnight exchange was due. Nothing. He logged it the same way. Calm, specific. I watched his face and could not read it. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We will see." We went to bed. I lay awake for a while, listening to the stairs. The stairs creaked in their usual way, the 3rd step from the bottom, and the 7th, and 2 near the top. And I categorized them as I had been taught and eventually slept. In the morning, I rose before Otto, which was unusual. I went to the signal room and looked toward Tower 28's ridge and saw nothing unusual. Forest, cloud, a strip of pale dawn sky. The lamp was cold. I lit it and signaled, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long. Nothing came back. Otto came up while I was signaling. He stood in the doorway to the signal room and watched me repeat the pattern. "How many times?" "4." He nodded. He went to the south window and looked out, then to the east-facing gap in the parapet where the line of sight to Tower 28 ran through a gap in the spruce canopy. He stood there for a long time. "Tower 26?" he said. I swung the lamp and signaled. Tower 26 came back immediately, clean and prompt as always. "Good," he said. He went to the logbook. "Log the time and the failure." He paused. "And look toward Tower 26's ridge this morning while you watch. Look for smoke." I understood what he meant. I took the binoculars to the platform and, as I scanned the south, also checked both neighboring ridges each pass. Tower 28's ridge, no smoke from its stovepipe, no movement on the visible section of the path that led down from the tower to the track below. Nothing on the laundry line. But then Brenner and Hugler might not have hung laundry that day. No smoke could mean they had simply banked the fire hotter and it wasn't producing visible exhaust. Could mean anything. Tower 26's stovepipe, smoke, steady, domestic, good. I went back inside and said so to Otto. He had made coffee and was sitting at the table with his hands around the tin cup, not reading. He had the expression of a man composing something in his head. "3 options," he said. 1. Equipment failure. Their lamp is broken, or their oil is bad, or their shutter has seized. In that case, they will have noticed this morning that we are not receiving their signal, and they will be attempting alternates. Mirror, bell. The wind is wrong for bell. We should try the mirror in case they are on mirror. He looked at the lamp. 2. Illness. 1 or both men incapacitated. Fever, injury, something that prevents them from reaching the signal room. And 3? He was quiet for a moment. 3 is what the rider is for, he said, which is why I am not calling it 3 yet. He took the mirror and angled it toward the east-facing gap in the parapet and began signaling in heliograph. But the sky was overcast, the sun behind cloud, and the mirror produced no usable flash. He tried for 5 minutes and then put it down. "I'm going to Tower 28, he said. "The protocol. The protocol says a rider is sent after 2 failed exchanges, minimum 12 hours apart. I have 2 failed exchanges, and it has been more than 12 hours between the first and the morning attempt. The protocol does not specify that the rider must be from the nearest garrison. It specifies that verification must be made." He was already reaching for his oilskin. "I am going to verify. That is my judgment. I am responsible for the line. I am not going to wait for a garrison rider to ride 20 kilometers when I can walk 3 and determine in 2 hours whether this is a broken lamp or something else." I said I should come with him. He looked at me. "One of us must remain at the tower. The line requires a manned post. Tower 26 must be able to reach us if they have an issue of their own." He buttoned the oilskin. "You will keep the log. You will run the standard signal exchanges at midday and evening. You will monitor for movement in the valleys. You will keep the lamp trimmed and the oil at level." He picked up his rifle. "And if I have not returned by dark, you will signal Tower 26 with the yellow code." The yellow code was a non-emergency advisory. Notification to the neighboring tower that the sending tower required attention. Not the beacon, not an alarm. A request for the system to notice that something was not right. "And if you see confirmed heretic movement in the valley corridors," he said, pulling on his cap, "you do not wait for me. You raise the beacon." He looked at me for a moment, long enough that I understood he meant it absolutely. And then he went down the stairs and out the iron-banded door, and I heard his footsteps on the path below the tower. And then I heard the forest, and then I heard nothing. That day was the longest I had spent alone in my life, and I do not mean that sentimentally. I mean that the hours were genuinely long in the way that isolated hours become long when the mind begins to supply what the senses do not. I did the morning maintenance, oil levels, winch test, logbook. I sat the watch on the platform with the binoculars and scanned the valley corridors in their proper arc. I noted nothing. Cloud, moving shadow, the usual arrangement of trees. I went inside and made the coffee substitute and ate biscuit and salt pork and wrote in my personal notebook and did not write anything interesting. The stairs creaked at 11 in the morning, which was not their usual hour. I went and looked, and there was nothing. I filed it in the correct category, which was harder than it had been when Otto was there. The midday signal exchange with Tower 26 went normally. I added a note after the confirmation. Tower 28, dark since 1831 previous day. Tower mate Falk, O, investigating on foot. Solo post until his return. I did not know if Tower 26 could read extended code, but I sent it anyway. They responded with a simple confirmation. Whether they understood the note or simply acknowledged the signal, I could not tell. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I went to the platform and looked east along the ridge toward Tower 28. The forest was the same color it had been all day, gray-green in the flat autumn light, the larches standing yellow and thin among the darker spruce. The path from Tower 27 to Tower 28 ran roughly along the ridge spine, dropping into a shallow col and rising again, and the first 500 meters of it were visible from the platform if I used the binoculars and held them steady enough to compensate for the slight shake in my hands. I could see the path where it disappeared into the col, and nothing on it. I told myself this was fine. Otto was 3 kilometers away. He had been gone for 3 hours, and the path was not visible from this end for most of its length. He was at Tower 28, determining that Brenner had a broken lamp and a head cold, and he would be on his way back by now, and I was being a boy about this. At 4 o'clock, I looked again. Nothing. At 5:30, with the light going amber and thin, I went to the signal room and attempted the evening exchange with Tower 28. Nothing. Tower 26 responded normally. I waited 1 hour past dark. I went out with the rifle and walked 100 meters along the path toward Tower 28 and stood in the dark and listened. The forest was quiet. No wind, which was unusual. The usual small sounds of night forest, the settling of branches, the distant sound of water somewhere down the slope, and nothing else. No lantern moving through the trees, no footstep on the path. I went back to the tower. I filled the lamp. I sent the yellow code to Tower 26. I lit the stove and sat next to it with the rifle across my knees and the logbook open on the table and wrote 1924. Tower mate Falk, O, has not returned. Yellow code sent to Tower 26 at 1921. Maintaining post. Tower 28, dark. Then I sat there for a long time, not writing anything. I did not sleep that night. Or rather, I slept in the way that exhaustion forces on a body that the mind is trying to keep awake. Shallow, interrupted, full of the sounds of the tower amplified by attention. The stairs creaked at irregular intervals. The stove clicked as the metal cooled when I let the fire bank low. The signal lamp on its shelf made no sound, but I found myself looking at it every time I woke, as if I expected it to be answering a signal I had not sent. Dawn came gray and cold. I was at the signal room before the light was fully up. I signaled Tower 26 first. They responded within 30 seconds. I exhaled. I turned the lamp east and signaled Tower 28. Standard morning code, full and clean. Nothing. I checked Tower 26's ridge with the binoculars. Smoke from the stovepipe. I checked Tower 28's ridge. No smoke, no movement, no laundry, nothing. The stovepipe stood dark against the pale sky. I went outside and looked at the path. The rain had come in the night, not hard, but steady, and the muddy section of the path near the tower base was marked with boot prints going out, which were Otto's. I looked at them for a moment. They were the prints of a man walking at a normal pace, heading east, the toes pointing downslope into the col. They did not show a running man or a man who had stumbled or a man who had changed direction. I followed them 50 meters. The path curved around a stand of spruce and dipped toward the col, and there the prints became harder to read in the leaf litter and root-crossed ground. I crouched and looked. Here was a print, and here, and then a section where the ground was disturbed in a way that was not the ordinary disturbance of one man walking. A wide flattening of the vegetation, like something had been dragged across it or like two people had moved together quickly, and then nothing. The prints did not continue in the normal way. I looked further along the path. A torn strip of cloth caught on the lower branch of a spruce at about knee-height pale fabric. I did not touch it. I looked at it for a few seconds and then looked at what was around it. The vegetation on both sides of the path here was crushed, not broken. The stems were bent, not snapped, as if something large and heavy had pressed through them or been pressed through them. On the right side of the path, in the direction of a shallow hollow between two root buttresses, a dark smear on the moss and leaf litter. Not rain shadow, not mud, something that had run and sat and thickened. I went back to the tower. I went to the signal room. I did not touch the beacon winch. I sat with the logbook and wrote what I had found, with the time and the location. I wrote precisely. I did not write the word I was thinking. I wrote evidence of possible disturbance on path approximately 50 millers east of tower base, and I described the signs: flattened vegetation, fabric fragment, dark residue on ground. I left it at that. Then I went to check the beacon. This was when I found the second problem. I am not certain, looking back, which was worse to discover: the evidence on the path, or what had been done to the signal mechanism. The beacon cage hung at rest at the base of its winch arm, level with the platform surface. To raise it, you turned the winch handle clockwise, which engaged the ratchet and drew the cage up the arm's track on its iron pulleys until it reached the crown and locked in the raised position. The handle was iron, cold in the morning air, and I gripped it and turned it and felt the first resistance of the pawel engaging the ratchet. And then I felt the wrongness. The handle moved, but wrong. Too heavy at first, then too free, as if something in the mechanism was not catching correctly. I turned it again, and the cage rose perhaps 20 centimeters and stopped. I could hear the ratchet clicking, but the cage was not tracking properly along the arm. I looked at the mechanism from the side. The track along the winch arm was clear. The rope was intact. The pulley wheels, I could see 2 of them, were at first glance fine. I leaned over the parapet to look at the third pulley, the one at the base of the arm where the rope turned and redirected toward the cage, and I saw it. The pulley housing was dark, not rust dark. Rust is dry and grainy, but slick dark, as if something had been poured or pressed into the gap between the wheel and the housing. I reached and touched it with the tip of a finger and drew it back and looked at what was on my fingertip. Something fatty. Something with substance, not quite liquid, not quite solid. A thick, clotted material that smelled faintly of iron and something else I could not immediately name, something organic and warm despite the cold morning. It was worked into the gap between the pulley wheel and its housing like someone had packed it there deliberately. And there was more of it coating the rope itself for about a half meter where the rope ran over the pulley. I wiped my finger on my trouser leg and looked at the other pulleys, the same on the second. I moved the winch handle slowly and watched the mechanism. The rope slid, or tried to, but the material in the pulleys made it drag and jump rather than running cleanly, and the ratchet was catching at wrong intervals because the load transmission was inconsistent. I went inside to the signal room and looked at the shutter lamp. The lamp itself appeared intact. The body, the lens, the shutter. But when I attempted the shutter lever, it moved only part way. I opened the lamp body. The hinge of the shutter was blocked. Something had been pressed into the hinge gap, the same thick, fatty material, dark and clotted, cold now in the morning air. I put the lamp down. I looked at the oil reservoir on the shelf. It was a flat tin canister with a cap, clearly labeled part of the standard equipment. I opened the cap and looked inside. The oil was there, but its surface was wrong, broken, clouded, as if something had been introduced to it. I tipped the can slightly and watched the oil move, and it moved slowly, with a viscosity that was not paraffin's clean fluidity. Something had been mixed into it, or dissolved in it, or had contaminated it from a source I could not immediately identify. I closed the cap. I stood in the signal room and looked at the fouled lamp and the fouled oil and thought about the fouled beacon mechanism and the crushed vegetation on the path and the cloth fragment on the spruce branch and the dark stain on the moss. And I thought about what it meant that all of these had been done, apparently, while Otto was on his way to Tower 28 and I was asleep in the tower below. Something had come here, while I slept, while the fire banked, while the stairs creaked in the cold, and it had not come for me. It had come for the signal. I want to be honest about the next few hours because I think it matters to understand what I chose and why. I considered, seriously, leaving the tower. Walking west toward Tower 26, following the ridge, covering the 3 kilometers in perhaps an hour, and presenting myself at their door and explaining what I had found and letting whoever was in charge of Tower 26 make the determination. That was a rational option, and I do not look back on it with contempt. I was alone. My tower mate was missing, the signal equipment was compromised, and I had found physical evidence that something had moved through the forest near my post without my knowledge. But the rotation point, the thing Otto had said more than once in different forms, was this: the line must carry the warning. That was the function. That was the purpose of the post. 2 men in a tower in the forest are not in themselves important. What is important is the chain of signal, the connection, the relay. If I walked west to Tower 26, I was abandoning Tower 27 to darkness, and Tower 27 dark meant the chain was broken at that point, and if anything needed relaying from the south, it would fail. More than that, if Tower 28 had been compromised, and I was increasingly certain it had, then the threat was east of me, not west. Walking toward Tower 26 was walking away from it, and if the same thing that had fouled my beacon was moving west along the ridge, abandoning my post, meant the line went dark behind me with nothing to report what had happened. Also, Otto might still be at Tower 28. I did not believe this, not fully, not in the rational part of my mind that was looking at the evidence with something close to honesty. But the part of my mind that had spent 3 weeks listening to him explain his trade and learning from him and eating salt pork and biscuit across the table from him was not ready to cede the point. He had been gone one night. Men in worse situations than that had survived. I cleaned the signal lamp as best I could, working the clotted material out of the shutter hinge with a knife tip and a rag, flushing the housing with a small amount of the reserve oil from a secondary can that appeared uncontaminated. The shutter moved better after this, though not perfectly. I signaled Tower 26 with the yellow code again and added, in the extended notation, the word sabotage. Whether they could read it at that distance I was not sure, but I sent it 3 times. Then I put on my coat and picked up my rifle and went east along the path toward Tower 28. The forest between the towers was about 45 minutes of walking on a dry day, in wet conditions with leaf litter slick on the path and the clay sections of the track muddy and soft, perhaps an hour. I went carefully, keeping to the edge of the path where the ground was firmer under the tree roots, and I tried to watch in all directions at once, which is not something a person can actually do, and the effort of attempting it is exhausting. The section of path where I had found the signs of disturbance the previous day, I did not stop there, but I looked as I passed. The dark stain was still there. In the morning light it was darker and more clearly defined than I had seen it at dusk. Not a splash or a trail, but a pool that had soaked into the leaf litter, the kind of volume that could not have come from a minor wound. The crushed vegetation on either side of the path was still pressed down, not sprung back, which meant whatever had caused it was heavy or had been there for some time. I did not find anything else on the path. No further signs, no dropped equipment, no more cloth. The trees went on the way trees do, indifferent, identical, the path winding between them in its ancient ridgeline way. Twice I stopped and listened. The forest was quiet in the way a forest is quiet when the weather is settled and there is no wind. Background noise only, the distant sound of water, the creak of branches settling. No bird sound, which I noticed but filed without immediate interpretation. The col between the towers was a low point in the ridge where the path dropped perhaps 30 meters in elevation before climbing again. The floor of the col was damper than the ridges, the ground there mossy and soft, and I found something in the col that stopped me for perhaps 2 minutes. I cannot describe it precisely because I was not certain what I was looking at. The best I can say is that it was a depression in the soft ground, roughly 2 meters by 3, where the moss and soil had been compressed down and then disturbed again in a pattern that was not the pattern of an animal resting or a man sitting or anything I could reference from experience. The depression was not a single impression, but a series of overlapping ones, as if something very heavy had set itself down and moved and set itself down again. At the edges of the depression, in the soft clay, there were marks that might have been impressions of some kind, though their exact nature was unclear to me. The moss within the depression was darkened in a way that was consistent with the stain I had seen on the path, though spread more widely. On a root buttress at the south edge of the depression, something had impacted hard enough to crack the wood of the root. Not cut it, not saw it, not break it cleanly, but crack it in the way things crack under a crushing blow. The wood fibers collapsed rather than separated. I stood there for 2 minutes, and then I continued toward Tower 28. Tower 28 came into sight through the trees as the path crested the far side of the col and climbed toward the eastern ridge. It was the same design as our tower, the same squat round stone structure, the same iron-banded door, the same platform at the crown, but from a distance it had a quality I had never observed in it before, which was emptiness. Not absence of motion, which was normal at this time of morning if the men inside were at breakfast, but a quality in the structure itself, a stillness that was slightly wrong in the way that a still animal is wrong because ordinary things, even still ones, produce some small evidence of occupation. A coat left on a hook casts a shadow through the window. A fire in the stove shows in the color of the glass of the signal room. Occupation is a kind of light. Tower 28 showed none of this. It was cold and still, and the stovepipe was dark, and the signal room window was opaque in the flat morning light, and the door was standing slightly open. The door was standing slightly open. This was wrong. The protocol was that the iron-banded door was kept closed and latched at all times except during active passage, because the bottom floor served as a defensive hold and an open door compromised the basic defensibility of the structure. Neither Brenner nor Hugler would have left it open except by accident or emergency. I stopped at the edge of the tree line, about 30 meters from the tower base, and looked at the open door for a long time. I looked at the platform. I looked at the signal room window. I looked at the ground between me and the door. The ground between me and the door was wrong. It was not a matter of one thing being wrong. It was a matter of several things being wrong in ways that compounded each other. There was debris on the ground that should not have been there. Something that looked like broken ceramic, possibly a tin mug or a small plate, shattered and scattered in a rough arc. There was a rifle. I could see the stock clearly, lying against the base of the tower wall, not leaning but simply lying there, as if dropped rather than placed. The ground near the door was dark in a wide spreading pattern, darker than the surrounding earth, and the quality of the darkness was the same as the quality of what I had found on the path and in the coal. I came out of the tree line slowly, rifle raised, moving toward the door. The smell reached me before I reached the door. Not the smell of death exactly. I had smelled that before, at the front, when bodies lay in the open in warm weather, but a variant of it. Something close to that spectrum, but not quite coincident with it. Heavier than rot. Warmer. With an animal quality underneath it, something that reminded me of the smell of a butcher's yard in summer heat, the smell of processed meat and rendered fat and the waste products of the process, something that had lived and been substantially reduced. I went through the door. The ground floor of Tower 28 was where the worst of it was. I am going to describe what I found there because it is relevant to understanding what happened, and because the nature of the evidence is part of the story. I am going to do this clearly and without excess, because excess would not be honest. The floor was stone, the same undressed stone as our tower's ground floor. It was dark. Not uniformly dark. The pattern was uneven, concentrated toward the center and the base of the staircase, lighter toward the walls, but extensive. Something had come down with force on this floor, and the result had spread as results of that kind do. Along the base of the east wall, there was material that had impacted and been absorbed into the stone joint lines, filling them. The rifle in the debris pile had its stock cracked through along the grain, as if it had been folded rather than broken, the wood compressed rather than split, and the barrel was bent slightly from true in a way that would have required considerable force to achieve. There was a boot on the floor near the south wall. One boot, the right, with the laces still tied, which is the detail that stopped me longest. On the wall above the boot, at about shoulder height, there were marks in the stone. Not scratches, not writing. Impacts of something hard, repeated, in roughly the same location, that had chipped the surface of the stone and left a smear across the chipped area that was the same color and quality as everything else in the room. The marks were roughly circular in form and approximately the diameter of a man's fist, though they were not fist marks. They were too uniform for a fist and too hard for any bare-handed impact to have chipped dressed stone. I backed away from the wall. I looked at the staircase. The lower section of the staircase had similar signs. Debris on the steps, material on the wall beside the third step. A section of the handrail rope snapped and hanging. The staircase led up into darkness. I did not go up the staircase. I went back out the door and stood in the gray morning light and breathed the cold air, which was clean and ordinary, and told myself to think. The rifle had not been fired. I checked the breech from a distance when I retrieved it, and the round was still chambered. Whatever had happened here had happened too quickly for Brenner or Hugler to fire. Or they had tried and had not managed to cycle the bolt. Or whatever took them had taken them before they could reach their rifles. Whatever took them. I did not know, then, precisely what had taken them. I had evidence of extreme violence and the absence of bodies. What was on the floor and wall was not a complete body, but rather the residue of one, or more than one. And I had a smell and a pattern of damage that was not consistent with human violence. A man can kill another man. A man cannot produce the kind of force that bent that rifle barrel without mechanical assistance, and there was no machinery here. I was thinking about this, standing outside the door, looking at the ground, very carefully not thinking about what the smear near the south wall might represent, when I heard the sound. It came from the forest to the east of Tower 28, not from the direction I had come, not from the ridge path or the coal, but from the downslope, the eastern face of the ridge, where the forest thickened and fell away toward the valley below. A sound that I can only describe as the sound of something large settling its weight, a compression of organic material underfoot, a shifting of branches, and underneath it, underneath the ordinary forest noise of it, something else, a sound that was between a breath and something else, something processed, something that breathed through the act of processing. I was already moving back toward the tree line before I had made a conscious decision to move. The rifle was up. My boots were quiet on the open ground, then loud on the path surface, then quiet again in the leaf litter at the tree line. I found a stand of beech with a root system that gave me something to put my back against, and I crouched behind the largest root and looked toward the eastern face of the ridge. It came out of the trees slowly. I want to say it emerged, because that word implies intention and direction, but what it actually did was move through the tree line the way something large moves through dense growth, by displacing what is in its way. The spruce at the edge of the tree line on the east face were not large trees. They were the wind-shaped, stunted spruces of ridgeline growth, their branches beginning close to the ground. And as the thing came through them, they moved aside in the same way that vegetation moves when a vehicle drives through it, bending, pressing flat, springing back only partially once the mass had passed. The mass that passed through them was not a vehicle, but it moved with the same indifference to the vegetation as a vehicle. No slowing for branches, no turning aside, a straight line from where it was to where it was going, and the forest be damned. It was big. It was large in the way that a horse is large, in that you are aware, looking at it, that it occupies more space than you do, and that this is a relevant fact. It wore armor. I registered this almost immediately, the dull gray sheen of it through the trees, and then in the open, reinforced plate on the chest and shoulders and forearms, the kind of heavy armor I had seen in illustrative plates in military publications about the new Antioch forces, but had not seen on a living creature before. On its head, a combat helmet, the heavy riveted kind, slung low, with a deep brim that threw the face into shadow. Under the brim I could see, not features at that distance and in that light, but the suggestion of a face, wide, pale, shaped differently than a human face in ways I could not immediately specify. In its right hand, and this I could see clearly, because the hand that held it was massive and the object it held was massive, and both of them were catching the morning light. It carried a tenderizer maul, a great hammer, the head of which was broader than my shoulders and longer than my forearm, on a shaft that the creature carried with the same casual weight that I carried my rifle. The head of the maul was marked, not rust, not mud, but marks that I recognized in quality if not in specific form, marks of the same kind that I had seen on the wall inside Tower 28. It stopped at the edge of the clearing around the tower base and looked at the tower. I could see it do this, the slight movement of the helmeted head, the orientation of attention toward the structure. It was not looking at me. It did not appear to know I was in the tree line 20 meters to its left. It was looking at the tower the way a man looks at a meal that is not quite ready. Then it looked down at the ground around the tower's base, and I watched it register the ground in the same way that I had registered it, cataloging, assessing, and I understood from the quality of its attention that it was looking at the evidence of what it had done and feeling something about this that I could not precisely identify, but that had some relationship with satisfaction. Its belly moved. I say this because I noticed it, and because it is relevant. The armor on the creature's torso was heavy, but not heavy enough to conceal entirely the movement beneath it. Something shifted beneath the plates in the way that something shifts inside a container when the container moves. The creature had not moved in that moment. It was standing still, looking at the tower, but something inside it had moved. I was on my feet and into the forest before this thought completed itself. I did not run, because running makes noise, and noise is attention, and attention from the thing I had just seen was not something I could survive in open forest. I moved fast, in the way I had learned to move in fieldcraft exercises at training, low, controlled, using the root systems and the beech trunks for cover, stepping on root rather than leaf, going perpendicular to the tree line before turning west. I went 50 meters south into the trees before I turned west toward the ridge path, and then I allowed myself to move faster. Behind me, at some point, I cannot say exactly when because my attention was forward and the forest was noisy with my own passage, I heard a sound from the direction of Tower 28. A sound of something heavy impacting stone, and then another, and then, further away and above it, the bright, brief sound of iron on iron, which was the sound that a signal lamp makes when you hit it with something very large. I ran for the path. The return to Tower 27 was 45 minutes of the worst walking I have done. I was moving as fast as I could while still maintaining enough silence and attention to be aware of what was around me, and the attention part required most of my capacity because the rational part of my mind kept trying to explain what I had seen, and the rest of my mind kept interrupting with the observation that the explanation I was arriving at was not one I wanted to arrive at. The thing I had seen was not a soldier. It was not a man in heavy equipment. The proportion of its body was wrong for a man in any amount of equipment, and the way it moved was wrong. Not the mechanical wrongness of something clumsy or injured, but the fluid, automatic wrongness of something that has never needed to think about its weight because its weight has always been the most important thing in any space it occupies. And the belly that had moved when the thing was standing still. I had heard of sin-eaters. I had heard of them the way one hears of things in wartime, in the way that rumor and briefing and the accounts of men who have seen things they cannot quite frame in ordinary language all fold together into a category that the mind labels as extraordinary and files for later examination. The heretic legions commanded creatures that were not human or had been human once and had been made otherwise. The Hellgate's influence did not discriminate. It took the willing and the greedy and the corrupt and the weak, and it changed them into something that reflected what they had always valued at their core. Greed made things that took, rage made things that destroyed, and gluttony, the bottomless animal need that some men cannot master and so are mastered by, gluttony made the sin-eaters, once mortal, turned by their own appetites and the Hellgate's infinite willingness to serve those appetites, into something that existed only to consume, to devour, to carry what it had devoured inside itself and go looking for more. Reinforced armor because the thing underneath it had long since ceased to be manageable by any means a standard weight body could survive. A helmet that kept the face in shadow because the face had become something that ordinary men found disturbing in a way that the armor could not entirely conceal. A maul for the work of rendering things small enough to swallow because the appetite was absolute, and the process of satisfying it was industrial rather than precise. The maul head wide as my shoulders. The marks inside Tower 28. I stopped thinking about it and focused on the path. Tower 27 was as I had left it. Door closed and latched, lamp burning in the signal room, logbook open on the table at the morning entry. I went straight up to the signal room, passing the stove without stopping, though I was cold enough to want to. I checked the lamp. The shutter was moving better since I had cleared the hinge, not perfectly, but well enough to send a signal. I needed to raise the beacon. The beacon was the appropriate signal for this situation. Not the yellow code, not the extended notation, not the lamp exchange with Tower 26. The beacon. The one signal that was visible from 20 kilometers in clear conditions, and that meant, in the signal protocol's unambiguous language, confirmed hostile presence on the line. This was what the beacon was for. This was the situation the protocol had been designed to address. I went to the platform. The morning was still gray, the cloud cover unchanged. The beacon cage hung at its rest position. I gripped the winch handle and turned it. The fouled pulleys caught the rope again, the wrong drag, the wrong transmission. I put my weight into it. The cage rose perhaps 30 centimeters, grinding, the rope juddering through the contaminated pulley housing, and then the ratchet slipped. Not failed, but slipped, caught a tooth wrong because the rope tension was inconsistent, and the cage dropped half its rise and swung slightly on the arm and then hung there, not fully raised, not at rest, not locked. I tried again, the same result. 30 centimeters, grinding, slip, drop. I went back inside and found the knife and a rag and worked at the second pulley, the one I had not cleaned that morning, scraping out the fatty, clotted material as best I could in the cold. It was stubborn. The material had been worked in thoroughly, and the cold had thickened it further. I worked at it for perhaps 10 minutes and extracted enough to allow the pulley to turn more freely. Then I went back to the winch. The cage rose, 40 centimeters, 60, a meter. The grinding was less, the rope tracking better. I cranked the handle with both hands, putting my whole body into it, and the cage rose along the arm in its stuttering, imperfect way, and reached the halfway point, and the ratchet locked on a good tooth. And I stopped and breathed. Then the rope slipped again. The paraffin contamination in the second pulley had not been fully removed, and under load, with the weight of the cage at the end of the arm, the rope was pulling through a surface that could not hold it properly. The cage dropped. Not free fall, the ratchet held it on that tooth, but it dropped the 10 centimeters the tooth had given it before locking, and swung, and I could hear the arm mechanism straining under the inconsistent load. I held the winch handle and looked at the cage hanging halfway up the arm and understood that I could not raise it further. Not without tools I did not have, not without time to properly clear and re-clean every component of the mechanism, not with one person and an hour of available time and a sin-eater moving somewhere in the forest 3 kilometers to my east. I could light the cage where it was, halfway up the arm, unsteady, not in its locked position. The beacon oil might still burn, the fiber bricks would still catch. But the light at half height was dramatically less visible than the light at the crown. And the cage was not stable. If the wind picked up, or if the mechanism slipped further, the burning cage could swing or drop, and a cage full of burning paraffin-soaked fiber dropping onto the platform was not a problem I was prepared to deal with alone. I tried the signal lamp instead. I positioned it at the parapet edge and sent the emergency code, not the standard exchange, not the yellow notation, but the formal emergency signal that the protocol reserved for confirmed hostile contact. 1 long, 1 short, 1 long, 1 long, hold. I repeated it 5 times, directing it south toward Tower 26. Tower 26 would receive it or not. If they received it, they would relay it to Tower 25, and Tower 25 to Tower 24, and so on down the line to the garrison. Whether the partial signal from a compromised lamp at this range was clean enough to read, whether the cloud cover and the angle of the morning light were cooperating, whether the men in Tower 26 were at their signal room at this moment rather than on watch or at breakfast, I did not know. I sent the signal, and then I sent it again. Then I went to the platform and looked east. Nothing moved on the visible section of the ridge path. The forest was gray-green and still. The spruce and beech went on as they had always gone on, indifferent, arranging themselves between me and whatever was in them. I looked west. Tower 26's ridge was invisible from the platform at my angle, but the open section of the valley below was not, and I could see, in the pale morning light, 3 kilometers south of the ridgeline, in the corridor between the 2 main valley walls that ran northward from the passes, something that resolved slowly under the binoculars from a smear of movement into a more specific shape. Vehicles. Not wagons, not the ordinary traffic of a mountain road, but military vehicles, the blunt profile of heavy transport, moving in a column formation along the valley floor. I counted what I could see, 5, 6, and behind them a longer interval and then more, and behind those a darkness in the valley that might have been a larger formation still, beyond the point where the road bent and the tree line closed off the sight line. Moving north. Moving north through the valley corridor that our post existed to watch. I looked at the beacon cage, hanging halfway up its arm, unlit, contaminated, compromised. I looked at the signal lamp on the parapet. I looked at the valley below, at the column moving north in its quiet and purposeful way, at the distance between the column and the passes behind it, and the distance between the column and Graz ahead of it, and I tried to calculate what I did and did not have in my hands to deal with this. I sent the emergency signal again. I sent it 6 times. Then I loaded the beacon cage with the compressed oil bricks and opened the secondary reservoir valve and lit the bricks with the striker. They caught. The flame was real, the good orange flame of properly burning paraffin fiber, and the smoke rose black and dense in the gray morning air. But the cage was at half height on the arm, swinging slightly in the morning air, and the visibility was 3 kilometers in the south-facing direction on an overcast October morning, and the nearest position that might see this signal on the appropriate axis was a long way from the garrison. I held the winch handle and watched the flame burn in its compromised position and thought about what Otto had said. 29 towers, each one is 3 hours, or 3 minutes, depending on which way you count. The flame burned. The valley below was dark with moving shapes, heading north. I could not hear the column from the tower. Military columns move quietly when they choose to, and this column was choosing to, and the forest and the distance and the ambient noise of the morning absorbed what little sound they made. They were visible only through the binoculars, only in the gap in the valley tree line, only for as long as that section of the road remained in sight. And then the column passed the bend, and the tree line took it. And I was looking at an empty stretch of road, and the forest, and the pale October sky. I kept the beacon burning. I kept signaling on the lamp. I do not know if anyone received the signal. The garrison at Brook was 40 kilometers to the north. The nearest telephone wire was 12 kilometers to the west. The rider that the protocol specified, one rider, not an army, just a man on a horse with a notebook, had presumably been sent by now, prompted by Tower 26's receipt of my yellow advisory, or perhaps not. Perhaps the extended notation I had sent had not been readable at that range. Perhaps Tower 26 had logged the yellow code as a routine advisory and had not yet escalated. Or perhaps Tower 26 had been compromised in the night and had not answered me this morning because of a working lamp and an attentive man, but because the fouling had been done elsewhere on the line as well, and I had been sending my confirmations into nothing. I did not know. I could not know. I had the beacon at half height, and the lamp at the parapet, and the rifle across my knees, and the logbook open beside me on the platform bench, and I wrote the final entry while the flame burned and the smoke rose. 0847. Column movement confirmed in Western Valley corridor bearing north, minimum 6 vehicles plus supporting elements. Exact numbers unclear due to tree line. Beacon raised to half height only. Mechanism fouled, unable to achieve full elevation. Emergency signal sent on lamp, 5 repetitions minimum. Tower 28 confirmed compromised, personnel unaccounted for, hostile presence confirmed in vicinity, nature unknown. Tower 27 manned and signaling, warning status maintained. I signed it. I put down the pen. The smoke from the beacon rose for another 40 minutes before the oil bricks burned down and the flame went out. I did not reload them. I was watching the valley. The column I had seen was the advance element, though I did not know this until much later. What came after it, through that corridor and through the two others I could not see from Tower 27's angle, was larger than anything I had the field of view to count or the knowledge to assess. I know it now only from what was subsequently recorded in other places and what was subsequently not stopped in time. The line was dark at its critical junctures. 28 had been silenced first, then my post's mechanism compromised, and I learned later, much later, when it was possible to reconstruct the sequence, that the same fouling had been done to Tower 25 and to the bell mechanism of Tower 24, working along the line from the east, like a hand drawing a curtain. A curtain drawn across the windows of a room where someone is trying to read a map in the dark. Graz did receive a warning. It came not from the tower line, but from a civilian, a woman who worked at a mill in the valley floor, who saw the column pass through the dawn and walked 3 hours to the nearest telegraph office and insisted on sending a message, though she could not estimate numbers, and the operator who received it at the other end noted in his log that the source was unreliable. The message arrived. It was noted. It was passed up the appropriate channels with the appropriate caveats. The appropriate channels were, by then, already approximately 6 hours behind the situation. 6 hours, in the kind of movement that column represented, is a very specific distance. Otto Falk's name appears in no official record that I was subsequently able to find. The garrison's incident report for the October engagement lists the watchtower line's failure as a mechanical and communications issue caused by equipment failure in multiple towers simultaneously. There is a line in the appendix noting that towers 25, 27, and 28 were found unoccupied at subsequent inspection, with evidence of disturbance at 27 and 28, and that one soldier, my name, rank, age, was found at Tower 27 in a satisfactory condition. The tower personnel of 28 were classified as missing in the engagement. I do not know what classified them means in this context. I have a reasonable hypothesis. I have had it since the morning I stood on the platform watching the beacon's smoke rise and the valley below stay dark. The rider eventually came. He arrived at Tower 27 at midday, a young corporal on a mud-streaked horse, looking at the half-raised beacon cage with an expression of professional concern, and then at me with an expression of unguarded relief. He wrote in his notebook. He asked me questions and I answered them accurately and completely, and I showed him the logbook and the fouled signal equipment and described the contents of Tower 28 and the nature of what I had seen in the forest clearing. He wrote all of this down. When he rode away, I was left alone in the tower for 2 more days before the relief came, and during those 2 days I maintained the log and kept the lamp trimmed and repaired what I could of the shutter mechanism and watched the valley below, which was no longer empty. It was not the kind of movement that should have been in those valleys. It was not a military column that could be assessed and reported and responded to with an appropriate force. It was the movement of an occupation already consolidating itself, moving quickly because the hours it should have lost to the warning had not been lost, drawing north through the passes like water finding the path of least resistance, north through Styria and north toward wherever it was going. I watched it from the platform. I kept the log. I did not raise the beacon again. It would not have helped by then. But I noted every movement I could observe, and I wrote it in the logbook in Otto's clean, precise way, time and observation and nothing edged toward drama. Just the facts of what I could see. Just the line of movement, bearing north, passing beneath the dark towers toward Vienna. There is one more thing I want to say, which is not in the logbook, and which I have never put in any official account. On the second morning of my solitary wait, before the relief came, I went back along the path toward Tower 28. Not all the way. I stopped at the col, at the depression in the moss where something heavy had rested, and I looked at the ground. The depression was as I had left it. The cracked root buttress was as I had left it. Nothing had returned to that place since I had passed through it. But on the east edge of the depression, in a gap between two root buttresses, there was a small object that I was certain had not been there the first time I passed. A rosary. Dark wood beads on a brass chain, the kind made simply and cheaply and carried by men who want something to hold in the dark. The cross was twisted out of its natural plane, as if it had been subjected to a very high pressure applied from two directions at once. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I picked it up and put it in my breast pocket, where I have carried it since. I do not know if it was Otto's. He was not, in my observation, a particularly devout man. He did not pray before meals or make the sign of the cross at difficulty or keep icons above his bunk the way some men do. But he kept a rosary. I had seen it once, near his botanical illustrations on the shelf, the kind of object that ends up in a pocket when a man does not think of himself as religious but understands that some habits are older than his opinions. I do not know what it means that it was there. I do not know what it means that the chain was still intact and the beads were all present and only the cross was damaged. I do not know if these things mean anything at all or whether I am looking for meaning in the residue of a process that was not about meaning, that was about appetite, that was about something fundamental and animal that found what it needed in a forest on a ridge in southern Styria in the autumn of 1914 and used it and moved on. What I know is this: the towers are part of the line. The line is what carries the warning. The warning is the 3 hours between the column moving and the garrison knowing. Those 3 hours are not abstract. They are specific. They live in the shutter lamp and the logbook and the clean oil in the reservoir and the cable running clean through the pulley housing. They live in the Goodnight Signal at 9 o'clock and the morning code before breakfast and the midday exchange at noon. They live in the rotation of 2 men watching the south so that the north can sleep. Take 3 hours from the right place, and you do not need to fight. You just walk north. The valley was still full of movement on the morning the relief rode in. I showed the sergeant the logbook and the equipment and the view from the platform. He looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to me and said, "You kept the post." I said I had tried. He looked at the half-raised beacon cage, still hanging at the midpoint of the arm, unlit, the pulley housing still dark with what had been packed into it. He reached out and touched the fouled mechanism, the same way I had touched it the first morning. Fingertip, contact, withdrawal, and looked at what was on his fingertip, and looked at me. "What is this?" he said. I told him what I believed it was. I told him what it was consistent with, given everything else I had found and seen. I gave him the account calmly and accurately, and without editorial. He listened to all of it. Then he wiped his fingertip on his trousers and looked out at the valley and the line of movement below and did not say anything else for a long time. Eventually he said, "We will need to do the other towers." I agreed that they would. He left 2 of his men with me and rode to do them. I stayed at Tower 27 and kept the log for the last time and watched the valley, and the valley watched nothing back. The towers stayed dark that night. No Goodnight Signal from Tower 28. No confirming pulse from Tower 26. Just the forest and the cold and the distant sound of something moving through the valleys below that had not been expected and had not been warned for, and was now simply a fact. One of the hard facts of October 1914, heading north without announcement, going where it intended to go. I kept the lamp trimmed. It was the only thing I had left to keep.